will continue from where we left off last week, which is basically the Judges chapter 7 is about Gideon the judge, and we looked at his first part of his life, the first chapter, which is chapter 6. But what I wanted to start with is just to recap uh, about our the judges that we are studying. We looked at four already. First is Othniel, and it's interesting to see when you overlay it on a map in terms of how God calls people from different tribes, different regions. And as you look at it over the 12 judges, you will see that they're all over the place. So there is the eligibility criteria is not by, in terms of their lineage or in terms of the tribes, but God picks people from different tribes and different times to help lead his people. So as you would see, Othniel was the first from the land of Judah. And as they are moving north, Benjamin's tribe was the one who was picked. Shamgar, we are not really sure because it's a mixed background. And then Deborah was the fourth. And now we're fifth judge, which is Gideon. And he's from the tribe of Manasseh. And also, it is good to keep the neighboring tribes in mind when we look at the map, because it gives us a context in terms of the help that Gideon seeks with respect to the tribes that he calls out for help in his war against the Midianites. So as you would see, Ephraim is to the south of Manasseh, and to the north are Asher on the left, Zebulun, Issachar, and Naphtali to the top of it. So with that as a quick background about judges and where they came from, we look at a recap of the previous chapter, which is the first chapter about Gideon. The first one is the plight of the Israelites as of the time that Gideon is called. As with every judge that we looked at, they get a time of peace because of the grace of God intervening through the life of those judges. And the most recent one is 40 years of peace that they enjoy after the time of Deborah and Barak. And that again is broken by this vicious cycle that we've seen before of idolatry of Israel. And this time the attackers are not from where they are, but they're really nomads who come from elsewhere. And they come from the east of Jordan. And these nomads, today they're known by the Bedouin tribes, who are nomads who move with their camels around. They were part of, they were Midianites, then Amalekites, and probably Moabites and Amorites also. But what's interesting is if you go back to the map, to the right side where you see Manasseh, Gad, and Reuben, right at the bottom is approximately where Moab is. And it's below that that there is Edom, and way below that where Midian is. So they've come a long way to be where they will be entering into the territory on the left side of the River Jordan. So that's the context of who these people are. And they come in and they overwhelm the Israelites for over 7 years. And basically, because of the burden that the Midianites bring on them, the Israelites are forced to living in caves and dens of mountains. And their sheep, their oxen and donkey are all claimed. And not only that, the fodder that they have from their land is all used up by the enormous herds of camels that they bring along. So all in all, they are deprived of whatever the land produced. And they are restricted to life hiding in the caves and the mountains. And like the previous cycles, the next step is essentially they understand where they are at and they cry out to God in repentance. And the first response that we see from God in His grace is actually a prophet, not a deliverer. And his warning is, again, a fulfillment of the prophecy through Moses, that it is because that they have not listened to God Almighty, especially with respect to the gods that they worship. And then there is the second response, when an angel of the Lord appears to Gideon, and Gideon is not initially convinced about who that is. And the context of where Gideon is also important, from where he is taken and from where he goes to, in terms of that he was hiding, threshing wheat in a wine press. Now, Gideon, his initial response is that he is not the one most eligible or the one that should be picked like Moses, that his low status of his family background in terms of this clan as well as his tribe. And he is not convinced that why him, while he may believe that God is there to deliver them. He, like Moses, um, initially tries to convince himself that it is him that is being called. And the reassurance that God gives is that, I will be with you. And then there are the tests that Gideon uses to make sure that he's actually speaking to Yahweh, the God Almighty, and not to any of the other gods. And that is basically the sign that he, initial sign to the angel that appeared before him, where he brings his offering of meat and bread, and the Lord consumes it when the angel touches the meal with his staff on the rock. And there he worships God and he creates an altar, and the Lord is peace. But that night, he starts his action, and this is the last part, starting from verse 33 in chapter 6, where he starts to, I'm sorry, slightly before that, where he starts to act as what he has been asked to do. So once he's convinced of the sign, he is willing to move forward. And basically, he tears down his family altar that is to Baal, and the Asherah pole is cut down. And the neighbors, the people of the town, when they realized what has happened and who was behind it, essentially want him to die. But his father is the one who comes to his defense, interestingly, the one who had the altar of Baal in the first place. And we see that transformation happening, not just in Gideon's life, but in Joash as well. Now, with that, we move to today's passage, which is, we will start from the last part of chapter 6 and chapter 7. I thought this map was useful to see graphically, where you see that red circle is where Gideon's people will gather. That area near it is called the Harrod's Well. That is where the Israelites are going to gather. But the Midianites are just across that, where that red circle is, and that's called the Valley of Jezreel. And this, if you overlap it with the previous map, is right next to where Asher, Zebulun, and Naphtali are. And we'll come back to this map when we look at the direction which the Midianites move when they are attacked. Now, with that, we move to our first question for today. And this one is based on the very first verse. Okay. Now, the first question that we have is, the passage begins in verse 1 with a reference to Gideon as Jerubbaal. And this is just to get our conversations going. But we notice that he is referred to by that name only once in this chapter. So let's go back and see why he was called so, and what does it convey, both in terms of what his job was and in terms of what God is conveying to his people. So this is the time to open up, think over the question, and give your inputs via chat the first 2 minutes, and then anybody else who wants to speak over the microphone, welcome to do so. Over to you. Okay, thank you for all the people who typed in their answers. If you are here for the first time, you can use the chat window at the bottom to see all the answers that are being typed in by the various members. So anybody who wants to add to what has been typed so far?
I think the prayer chapter actually gives a reference to it.
Right.
6:32.
Right.
So because Gideon broke down the Baal's altar, they gave him the name Jerubbaal.
Right. That's correct. Absolutely. So the meaning is that he broke down Baal's altar, and that's why he got the name. So who gave him that name?
His father? Yeah, Joash, his father.
His father.
Joash's father gave it to him. That is right. And unlike what we see in terms of the names that are given by God, right, when Simon becomes Peter or Saul becomes Paul, they are no longer referred to in the Bible with their new names. In this case, he continues with the old name itself because it's a reference about something that Baal is supposed to do and not really a name change that God has assigned to Gideon. Okay. Any other comments that you wanted to make? Anybody else?
Yeah, actually, in line with what you said, and also there's an interesting comment that came in the chat. His purpose was to be more than tearing down the idols.
Yes.
So even when you look further down, 8, 9, you see other references to Jerubbaal as well as references to Gideon as Gideon. And one thing that stands out is whenever the Bible, whenever this book is talking about Gideon in relation to God speaking to him or he acting in accordance with God's commands, he's referred to as Gideon. But whenever he is referred to in the context of human history and in human discourse, there seems to be a reference to Jerubbaal. So I think Gideon is, I'm not going too deep at the next level, but that seems to be a pattern. So why that is so, I don't know. But clearly I see this pattern that whenever it is with reference to God and he acting in obedience with God, he is Gideon.
Right. Yeah, that is one thing that I wanted to point out. And the other thing is that this is really a challenge to a god named Baal. And you see that he's powerless. That is a point I think we also need to realize in this story, that we see the real God acting, but when challenged, the powerless no god named Baal, there is no mention of anything that he is able to do, in which tells us that he was not really a god. So there is a point being made with respect to that first verse as we go through the rest of the chapter, that we see that God is clearly saying that there is only one God and me and no one else. And there is proof in through the life of Gideon as well, right? That's the second part of the story about the name. Now we move to the next part of the passage, which is basically the part where God is going to choose a few men from the entire army, or a set of or the people who had gathered there, and we look at it that in detail. So this is the passage that goes from verses 2 through 8, and there are a lot of interesting things and a lot of questions that come up also. So I hope there is more participation in this question. So the question I have raised it is actually three parts. We know that God is going to have few men. Rather, his statement is, you have too many men. Why do you think God insists on fewer men? That's the first one. Second is, who decides the criteria in terms of picking those men, and what was that criteria? So please think over those three questions and give your inputs, first with chat and then over the mic. Yes, so some very good comments here that capture the essence of it. It's the word boasting, the word glory, all of it capture the essence very well. The first part, right, that's rightly pointed out here in this chat is about man's inherent nature to take claim and boast about it, right? Anybody else who wants to add beyond what has been shared here in the chat?
So this is my thought. Initially, also, if you look at it, 32,000 men versus what I've read in something is like it's more than 130 or 135,000 odd Midianites. So there itself, they were probably 4:1 or 5:1 kind of a ratio. So they
Right.
were, yeah, that itself would have got glory. But then he further reduced it by another 22,000. That is in accordance to what you're given reference in Deuteronomy, that if I am not willing, don't force me to fight for you. So if I'm fearful, so that is why that 22,000 people move out and they come down to 10,000. again, see, even this was like, when we do the ratio, it is 13:1, plus the camels and donkeys and all are there. So that itself is a big thing, right? Then it comes down to, again, like, bring it down further. So God was, the criteria was, yeah, it is decided by God, but he was looking for more of obedience and, people who are not going to put their mind in, or their intelligence, but obey God. And the second thing is, like, the way he chose that is, like, how, people drank the water. It is very interesting to note that, uh, uh, we think that, pigs may be the worst animal in Israel, but that's not that. It is dogs. And he asked people who drink like dog to be chosen. One is that, because if you're drinking through your hand, you're covering your face and you're not aware of your circumstance. It is more strategic. Second is, like, you're ready to do whatever you want, and you're at the moment, you're ready to take your arms and fight and all that. And not put too much intelligence, because God was going to ask them to do something. When we read to the next thing, like, it would need more of faith than, what do you call that, than intelligence. Like, if you put our intelligence into it, the strategy may not work, but if you put God's intelligence into it, it will work. So that is where he was, looking at this, and he was preparing for the strategy. Probably we'll see that in question 4 when I looked at it.
Right. Very good points, Santosh. A lot of it is actually, the context is important to keep in mind, right? It's not just about the numbers of Israelites, but the battle that they're going to fight is against a huge number of people. So in that respect, it's really difficult to understand the context of why God insists on fewer men when you're already in a minority compared to your opposition. But God has a purpose, and that is being revealed through these questions. So we will address each one of those, Santosh. Very good points. I see some questions here about the lappers and kneelers. It took me a while as well, but I don't think I have a final answer, but we'll discuss the various viewpoints on that as well. Anybody else who wants to share on what is on chatting? Those who couldn't chat, who want to share over the microphone? Okay, I guess not. I'm looking at the comment from Alvish on the Hebrew words for lapping comes from LKK, which is lake, and describing the dog licking up the blood of King Ahab. Okay, so that's a perspective that I've not looked at. In this verse, NIV translation has decided to apply the phrase drinking from cupped hands to the lappers, just as the original Masoretic Hebrew text does. Okay, so we'll come to that in a little bit, but before we go to the lappers versus kneelers, for which I have a separate slide, we will look first at the context. Like Santosh rightly said, we know that the Midianites, who they are currently seeing from the top of the mountain looking down into the valley, is at least 135,000. And how do we know that? If we look one chapter ahead, which is in Judges chapter 8, verse 12, we get the context about how many people are left and how many people are there. So you add up those and you get that there is at least 135,000 people that you are going up against. Now, in that context, when you look at your own team, it's about 32,000, right? And that itself is a minority, and you're still wondering, how are you going to handle the opposition? And in that context is when God is telling Gideon, you have too many men, and he also gives the reason, which is, I cannot deliver Midian into their hands, because then Israel would boast that my own strength has saved me. So the boasting part, which is inherent in all of us, can actually prevent God from working in us, and maybe the primary reason why it is a blocker in working through us. So God goes through this process of cutting this group of people down, starting with 32,000 and eventually being 300, but he does it in two phases. And there is, again, questions that come to mind with respect to the process. Why not in just one step with one filter? And why not, before they even started, just ask him to pick 300 and go. So there are aspects that are beyond our understanding in terms of God, how it works. And some of it become evident later in hindsight as to why it was done this way. So we look at first phase, which is basically based on those who are fearful and faint-hearted. Now, this is the context that Santosh again referred to. If you look back in Deuteronomy chapter 20, verse 8, he actually does say that please send back those who are fearful back home. So in this phase, actually 22,000 people go home, which means about 2/3 of the people that were with you when they saw their opposition felt fearful, and given the choice, a voluntary separation, picked the option of going home. But as some commentators say, we don't know if they even reached home, because soon after you would see that they were all called to chase the Midianites. So this is a self-made choice of a certain group of people who are fearful based on what they see, and not just based on fearing the Lord. And that's the first filtering that happened. And then the second phase is, even after that, there is only 10,000 left. God calls out and says, hey, still too many men, and I will thin them out. And here, I think some of the comments that were referred to here are important, because there are parallels between this and what we can see as references in the New Testament, in terms of many are called, but few are chosen, as in given in the Gospel of Matthew. And so you see there are two aspects to it. One is the choice that people themselves make, and then there is a choice or a calling that God has to happen on each one of us. Right? With that, we move to the next part, which is the more controversial part, which is around the process that is used for filtering the 300. From the 10,000, how the 300 are picked. So as the Commons rightly say, there are two groups of people, the lappers as well as the kneelers. And as the NIV Bible says, with the 300 men that lapped, I will save you and will give Midianites into your hands. And please let all the others go home. So to address some of the questions in terms of the significance of the lappers and the kneelers, and what does the cupped hands indicate? To be honest, there are some two schools of thought here, and in fact, there are two translations that differ slightly in respect to which group actually got picked. The group actually is lappers, but which group had their hands to their mouths differs in the two translations. For example, in the NRSV translation, it says, those who lap the water with their tongues as a dog laps, you shall put to one side. So those are the lappers. But as the next sentence says, those are not the ones who put their cupped hands. All those who kneel down to drink, putting their hands to their mouths, you shall put to the other side. And that number was 300. In contrast, you would see that in the NIV version, you would see the 300 men lapped with their hands to their mouths. So this is something that I don't think we have an answer to, but we can agree that the lappers were the ones who were chosen. And in this whole filtering process, there are two questions that come to mind. Now, what is the criteria that God uses? Is this evident at all? And if so, is there some indicators of what they were? Now, if you look at the lappers versus kneelers, there are again two schools of thought. One is that the ones who were putting the lappers were the ones who were the weak ones, right? You know, they were not looking around to see if anything is coming or alert to any situation. And they, again, like Gideon was chosen, the weak ones were the ones who were chosen so that all glory belongs to God. That is one aspect to it. But there is another school of thought which argues that they were the ones who were the alert ones, and hence they were the ones who were picked. It'll be interesting if any of you have your thoughts, to hear your thoughts, but I couldn't certainly come to a conclusion with regard to why one of these groups were picked. But if you look back at the previous filtering, the first phase, clearly there were people who were not taunted by what they saw or by the size of their enemy, probably because they put their trust in God. So their courage came from not what they saw, but who they trusted in. So that's the hypothesis that I have. But if any of you have, or Sushil, any of you have any additional thoughts, it'll be great to share with the group.
I actually concur with what you said. And with the reference from Matthew, many are called, few are chosen. We also studied earlier that God chooses differently from the way we choose, right? But does not say that God chooses arbitrarily. He chooses with some reasoning. There is a rationale for his choice. When few are chosen and many are called, there is a rationale always. So if you look at the two eliminations, like you pointed out, both seem to eliminate on the basis of the right kind of soldiers that he wanted. He wanted few, but he wanted the right ones. So the first, he eliminated those who were faint-hearted. Second, he eliminated those who were not alert. They didn't have the characteristics of vigilant and alert soldiers. You're very vulnerable if you're going down to lap water with your tongue, right? You have your knees on the ground, hands on the ground, and your head facing downwards. You can't see anything around you. So I think that's the impression that I get. God chooses, and he chooses with reason, the right people. It may not appear right in our eyes, but it does not mean that there is no reasoning behind why God chooses the way he does.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else who wants to add or any comments?
Yeah, Sujit. So mine is, I mean, almost same, but I'm with the other, school of thought, like alertness and vigilance, because if I look at it, my way is like, if I take a cup of water, I'm covering my face, and I do not have access to my weapon. Okay, but when you're lapping, you can put your eyes around and see if any movement is there, and my weapons, hands can be on the weapon. So that is my thought of my. I mean, that's where I am thinking. But
Okay.
again, when you read further, you will understand very clearly that he did not want people who will be putting too much intelligence and all that, but obey him, because he was going to ask them something which they have never done in the past. And actually, if you look at it, most of us will think it is a crazy plan, right? And it's a very big crazy plan, but they put their faith in God. So that is what I think he was looking at.
Okay, thank you, Santosh. Anyone else?
Yeah, so I am of similar opinion here, because if it is confusing for us, I'm guessing, venturing a guess, I guess in this case, that Gideon was also confused. But the real test is for Gideon when he is about to face the fight of his life, and he is not known for his bravery or his belief um, systems, right? And he is not really a soldier by itself. So the leader itself is a weak person, and God was able to use him to fight this battle. So I don't necessarily think that it's just cutting out of the weaker herd, if you may. It's more like, even if I don't understand the logic behind it, am I ready to follow the God, right? So that's something, I think the larger picture of this passage, maybe it is meant to be not understood and gone to the nth level of understanding by everybody. And are you still willing to jump with that leap of faith and follow the Lord? That's really where that's how I'm thinking about it.
Very well put, Rajiv. It's very well put. Yeah. So that I think summarizes it very well. It's probably times when we don't understand it that we will put our trust in God and still move forward. I think I concur with that. Anyone else?
Yeah, Sujit. I think I also more or less I was kind of agreeing with what Rajiv was saying, because in many places, example in Isaiah, we read, "His ways are not our ways, and his thoughts are not our thoughts." So maybe it defies human logic, and also we never understand why God chooses something other than the other. So I would tend to leave it at that also.
Right. Very well put. That's great. Okay, so with that, let's move to the third question, which is based on the next passage, which is basically another sign that Gideon gets before they attack the Midianite camp. But what is interesting to see is the progression that Gideon makes, right? Initially, he starts with 10 people. He pulls down the Baal's altar and the Asherah pole. Now he's got 300 men. And the tasks are becoming more difficult. And the interaction between him and God are now there is a certain pattern to it. There is a sign followed by a worship and followed by an action. So with that background, let's look at the next passage, which is basically from verses 9 through 15. So the question is, what was the sign that Gideon gets and how did he respond? The passage that you need to look at is from verse 9 through 15. So please give your inputs via chat first and then over the microphone. Okay, so some interesting comments. Sachin's comment about that loaf indicating the sword of Gideon. That's something that I was not aware of. That's interesting. Second is that the tent is that the bread loaf is going to overturn the tent. The interpretation of the dream. Sorry, my laptop is a little frozen right now. Not able to get to the. Okay, so anybody who wants to add to what has been shared on the chat?
Sorry, I hate typing, and so you'll have to bear with me.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so I mean, so God had given a go attack, but he sensed a bit of doubt in Gideon's mind, right? So that's why he is giving him another sign. It is interesting to know that he did not say, go to this particular tent or go listen to one particular fellow or anybody like that, right? So it means that that dream would have been with everybody in the Midianites camp. It would have been a widespread thing. Because God has, he did not pick and choose, okay, go to the third tent and listen to what those guys are saying, right? So God had a purpose in that. And when, and as many said, the loaf of bread. So barley bread is, what I've read is, it did not, I mean, it is, what Gideon is and all that. But when he hears this, that, God has given to him, he prays God then and there itself. He worships God, and then he goes back to the camp and prepares his men to fight.
Yeah, so interesting, but I'm not very sure that all of them had the same dream, because it says it was his dream, right? Gideon arrived just as a man was telling a friend his dream. So at least in the passage, it doesn't indicate that all of them had the same dream, but it's still inspiring that God took him to the right person who had gotten that dream. That's one. And the second interesting point I think Michael has pointed out is that this time the sign is being initiated by God, and Gideon is not the one who asked for the sign, right? That is another interesting thing about this particular sign. Anything else that others want to share? So sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, Sujit, I think what you said is probably where I am also at, because out of the 135,000 soldiers, to sort of zero in on two folks, random persons who would be discussing about this specific dream, I mean that would have given some assurance to Gideon that it is divine providence, right? Because he would also probably think that if something ubiquitous like a piece of loaf of bread, which might actually symbolize as a small army sort of destroying a larger army, right? Almost like a symbolic thing. I mean, to hear that and to reach that camp and just hear that from one person is definitely giving him the confidence that truly God is with them and the victory is delivered to them. I think it's definitely God's way of saying that, hey, this is the right time, right moment to do the attack, and that probably was very encouraging for him.
Absolutely. And there are a few things that I want to call out in this, apart from, of course, the actual process, how the dream was really was revealed to Gideon and his servant. What is interesting is, and the takeaway for me was how God provides based on the need of Gideon. So Gideon is a person who needs signs, and here is God now adapting and providing him, meeting him right at his point of need. This theme is actually seen throughout this the story of Gideon, because at the beginning you see that when the angel appears to Gideon, essentially he calls him the Lord of peace. In those times, what Israel really needed was prosperity and peace. And God is the one who exactly is going to provide that for Gideon. The same is what you see here as he sees Gideon operating. In fact, the offer for the sign says, if you are afraid to attack, then do this. And of course, the very fact that he went ahead with the sign shows that he was afraid to attack without a sign. So God is one who seemingly sees one step ahead, knows the very need for that person, and meets it right there. To me, that was very encouraging with respect to the adaptation of what God is doing for that the need of that very person. The second thing is, from what I've read, I've tried to look up in terms of why barley bread of all this, because if anything, Gideon was threshing wheat, not barley. But from what I could understand, the dream about the barley bread, it was used by the poorest of the poor. It was not as sticky or as good as wheat for making bread, but it was also, because it was used by the poorest of the poor, a symbol for lowliness, again, humility. So to show that a barley bread coming down the mountain and overturning the huge army and their tents is a symbol of somebody who is low in esteem being picked up and used by God to overcome the high and the mighty. And the third, what you have to give credit for with respect to Gideon, and probably a takeaway for us, is between what he sees and what he hears. Of course, what he sees is compelling enough for him to run away from where he is at or find the smallest reason to turn away. But he is comforted by what he hears and willing to move forward. It's a challenge for us, and throughout the Bible, we are often told, often we make the mistake of going by what we see. And if we give enough importance, or if we even take the time to hear, we may have a totally different perspective in terms of what we can do, the reluctant people that we are, right? So that's another thing that we can learn from this passage. And the last part is that pattern that you see right through is that before every action, there is true worship. He falls down, kneels, and he worships God. Again, a pattern that is worth emulating. So these are the few things that I thought of calling out. Are there other things that anybody else wants to share?
Yeah, so Sujit, I was just thinking about what comment Santosh had said earlier with respect to the dream coming to everybody. But in some way, it's not the dream, I would say, but I would say in some way, God was amongst the Midianites, not preparing them, but preparing them in a different way. Isn't it? Because the war was not a war finally, right? It was something else totally. So for all these people to align, to lose in that manner itself shows that God was amongst them, preparing them in a different way.
Absolutely. There's no doubt that God was making preparatory efforts to do that. In fact, when we get to the passage where the attack happens, right the end of, just before midnight, right, the second whatever it is called, second watch, right, it'll be, we can imagine right through in terms of the guards taking their positions, and they are essentially probably not even aware of what's going to happen around them and so forth. So God is working in them. The only part I was not sure of is whether the word of that dream spread around, possibly could have, but it's not directly indicated in the passage. Okay, then let's move on to the last question before our breakout question. So this is the next passage, which is actually where the plan unfolds, and nothing like what humans like us would have envisioned a war to be or a battle to be. So let's just take some time to think about what was the battle plan in terms of the preparation that the Israelites made. How did it play out? And how did the Lord provide? So the passage for this is from verses 16 through 25. Can you share your thoughts, think through what the battle was? Even if you look at the pattern of the battles that happened before in the conquests of the Canaan, each one had its own plans and how it unfolded. But this had its own variant to it. And like Vineet pointed out, and as we will hear again, God's ways are much different from our ways. And it's only more and more that we realize that it's not our plans, it's not what we strategize that is going to matter. It is more about doing the little things that we are called out to do and then wait for His plan to play out. So with that, let's move to the next set of questions. Please start sharing your answers via chat. Yeah, as has been pointed out in the chat, it's interesting that the weapons that they're carrying are not the traditional weapons. It is the torches, the jars, and the trumpet. Anything else that anybody else wants to add?
Yes. So Sujit, mine is purely strategy. I mean, I'm not sure about any. I mean, mine may not connect to biblical aspects and all that. Like many chats are there, but it's pure battle plan. What I think would have happened. Okay. So Gideon divided his. So it is more of a what do you call that? What do you call that? Jungle warfare kind of a thing. I had that word in my tongue. I missed that word. Anyway, guerrilla warfare. Sorry, yeah, guerrilla warfare. So he's divided his army into three parts. Okay, and in the traditional way, the torches were carried only by the commanders. Okay, so he's hidden. I mean, the strategy is that the men will come running down, and when the trumpets are blown, they will break the pots, and suddenly the lights are coming on. Everybody's having the lights, so it looks like that's a huge army. Okay, like 300 commanders plus people and all that. That's a huge army which is coming down, and plus the earlier confusion of the dream and all that is already there. Okay, God has already prepared them to be slaughtered. And then when this is happening, what I've also read is the Midianites were not pure like one tribe. They had Amalekites, they had Arabs and all that, and they did not understand each other's language. When they see this thing coming, they started attacking their own compatriots, not Midianites, maybe among themselves, and they started killing each other, thinking that this is the enemy. So that was all a huge battle plan, and the timing that was chosen was also perfect. Like one is it's middle of the night, and second it's like when the handover is happening. So my experience from leading a support team is that maximum number of drops happen during the handover, because one team is leaving, the other team is coming, and there's always an overlap that is happening, but in that overlap a lot of drops happen. So that was a perfect timing when they are not fully prepared. The first army is going to sleep, the second thing is coming and settling down, there is already confusion. On top of that, you see 300 commanders coming down with hundreds of soldiers following them. That's their thought. And there and 100 people were already present in the camp, right? Gideon brings only 200 people are running down the mountain. The rest are already in the camp. So the huge confusion contributes to all these things. This was God's plan. As I said earlier, if we had that 32,000 people, he would not been able to strategically strike these guys. But with 300 people, he did not have to use any of his people. Most of them died with their own swords.
Yes, well put, and thanks for sharing your perspective, Santosh. That support aspect gives us an idea about the issues that you face at changeover time. Anybody else wants to add? Okay, I've just put down a few points. It's not complete by any means, but wanted us to think about few things, right? So one is, why did God bring all these 32,000 people midway and then have them go back? He could have very well brought 300 from the beginning itself, right? Pick the 300. So what's interesting is the provisions that were carried for the 32,000 are actually left behind for the 300. So you can see that in, I believe, in Judges chapter 7, verse 8, right? So when the people who are going back, or is it from the 10,000 to the 300? One second. Yeah, so when the 10,000 are heading back, leaving behind the 300, the provisions and the trumpets are left behind. So that is one part of it. The second is the weapons, as rightly have been pointed. You know, in today's world, we try to match our enemies' weaponry or capabilities with our own capabilities. You look at our recent issues at Galwan Valley, and you see how our defense spending has gone up, to match or to outdo the enemy. So the important part of strategy today is to understand what our competitors are using and then basically outdo them. But here is a strategy which is completely based on faith, right? And you will see how it plays out only once it plays out, right? So they are going out. There are only 300 of them, 300 surrounding the entire circle of Midianites, which means they are not close to each other. They are spaced, and there are 300 of them who are willing to hold their positions around their camp, irrespective of what happens. And the strategy, as Santosh rightly called out, is these are lamps within the jars that cannot be seen, and once they reach there and their trumpet blows is when they flare up everything, and then all of a sudden the Midianites see that they're surrounded. They see the flares of light. But why night? Because at night they can't really see who is behind or how large is the army behind these flares. They think it is a large army, but that is part of the plan of how God indeed delivers them. Interestingly, as you have read from the passage, there is no war fighting happening between the Israelites and the Midianites. It's between the Midianites and the rest of them, or within themselves itself. And this is how the Lord delivered. So it's really a story about, at the end of it, of men doing their part and the Lord delivering, which is a powerful testimony for each of our own lives as well, or a powerful challenge to each of our own lives as well. Anything else that anybody wanted to add with respect to this question? Okay, so with that, let me just paste this for the chat. Okay, so the next question is the breakout question. I thought this was interesting in a certain way with compared to where we are today. You know, you think about the Midianites and their presence all over the place, leaving very little space for the Israelites to wiggle. And it's, in a lot of ways, that's where our situation is today. With the pandemic situation and the virus being everywhere, we're attacked from every side. We're hiding, much like they were, right? And then we are also asking, where is God in all this? Much like at the beginning, Gideon asked the question. The very person who was chosen to lead them out, he asked the question, did not the Lord bring us out? But now he has abandoned us. So there are a lot of things, I think, in today's situation that we can be encouraged from what we see in the story of Gideon. So it's more of an application question in terms of how will this make a difference in our own lives or encourage us in today's world. So that's our question. So now over to you, Minnie, to take you to the breakout rooms. For those who are here for the first time, you will be automatically taken to your breakout rooms. You just stay where you are at in Zoom. And then there is is it 5+1, Minnie?
6+1, you tell me.
I'm okay with any.
Yeah, I've made it 6+1.
Okay, so it'll be 6 minutes that you have for discussing. Please try to get everybody's viewpoint, but we do need somebody to represent each room to summarize the points when you come back, and there will be a 1 minute countdown at the end to give you a heads up in terms of the countdown, and then you will join back as one group at the end so that we can hear out from all of the groups. So with that, over to you, each of the groups.
Yeah. Okay, I'll break out now.
Okay.
Hello, Sucha.
Yeah, you can hear you. Go ahead, Ansi.
Yeah, okay. So the current pandemic situations, what we discussed is that these things that is happening around us has brought many things in place, which was earlier a lot of chaos. For example, less of pollution, lot of injustice happening, and people have changed their perspectives now. As in earlier, the kind of way we used to live, the kind of situations that we were in, we had a lot of wants, our desires, lot of things we wanted, but it is all changed now. We have come back to our most limited needs that we want. We've become more sensitive to people who are around us for their daily needs, or maybe for even the food that is there around us, the people who are in need of food, etc. And the opportunities that we had earlier, like going to church, the fellowship, the Sunday school things, and all our friends, the facilities we had earlier, which we used to take it for granted, we have learned to value it more. When we see death in front, our perspective changes. That is what we were discussing about. And how can we be encouraged? In spite of all these things, we believe our God is in control, and we believe that we are completely protected in Him. So that was what we have been discussing. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Room 2.
Yeah, so I'll call that for room 2. So in our group, what we discussed was that one is we need to accept the fact and the reality that he's still the creator and we are still the creation, right? with that said, we are still the stewards. We have no rights to question or the way things are. He's a sovereign Lord. There are a lot of things which is beyond our understanding and control, and pandemic is one such scenario, right? But what we can do as being God's chosen people is we can be faithful, and we need to, bend down our knees more and more in prayer, and we should be committed to that calling, right? We shouldn't be bothered about what's happening around us. Every verse, everything from the Bible, it teaches us the same thing. Many may fall around us, but it will not harm us. So that again comes back to the same point that you need to be faithful and you just follow your commitments. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Elvish. Room 3.
Is it? I think we were 4, I guess.
Yeah, you're 4. It was Evelyn, Jerry, Manu, Rajiv, Santosh. Room 3.
Yeah.
You're on mute, Jenny.
All right. So I'll go, guys, if that's okay. So basically, what we discussed is, how we all do feel surrounded, similar to Gideon and his army with the Midianites, right? Surrounded by this disease that's eating away at our fabric of society itself. Way of life is challenged, but I think it's time and a reminder for all of us to start really, believing and taking that next step in belief, right? As opposed to just think about it, figure it out in your own mind, be at peace with it, and then take the step, right? So yeah, I think that's a parallel that we are able to draw in all that we. So really, to trust in God and His plans. That's the bottom line that came about in our group.
Okay, thank you, Rajiv. Next one, group 4.
Okay. Yeah. Can you hear?
Yes, Vineet, we can.
So the situation, as we just heard, but what we discussed and concluded is that God understands our fear. He understands our weaknesses, the weakness of the situation, better than we understand ourselves. He knows our names. Though our faith may be weak and not bold like Gideon's, God does not abandon us. That's what we saw. And being in the hands of a sovereign God is better than striving to navigate the situation ourselves. So the question, like how Gideon exhorted in chapter 7:17, the question would be, the larger question would be, can we do likewise as Gideon, despite having a weak faith, but it was humble and genuine, and leaving it in the hands of a sovereign God to work it out.
Thank you, Vineet. Is that all, Vinny, or do we have a room 5?
That's all. 4.
Okay. So thank you, everyone. Thank you for sharing your viewpoints. I don't have a right answer for this, but as I read through this portion, I thought, how very relevant it is for our time. So I just put a few thoughts that came to my mind, and also some of the commentaries that relate to this chapter summarize it quite well and are very applicable in our days, right? The first one that comes to mind is a lot of things are upside down to our understanding of how the world is supposed to behave, or how we expect our environment to be. The first question that comes to mind is, as God filtered and chose His people, question that we have to ask is it for us as God's people that less is more? In a lot of ways, in a lot of situations, you see that a message is clearly conveyed to us, because that is when the Lord can act. That is when the glory will belong to Him. So we rely more on His grace, and it's captured in the Beatitude, right? That it's blessed are the poor in spirit, So that is one question that we have to ask as we are forced to be in this situation, the learnings that we take away from it. The second, like Rajiv called out, is essentially a question that we have to ask ourselves. Do we remain the reluctant people that we are? Or is there a step that we are called to take, each one in our own personal journey, with respect to what we need to do as our part in this for God to act, right? So there are two parts. We can look at what we see around and be discouraged or wait for things to move. But we can also be willing to listen to what he has to say and act and do the little things that we will be called to do. Being faithful to little things, the first step will help us move on to the next step. And you see God enabling Gideon every step of the way with a small team first of 10 people to bigger tasks that he steps up as Gideon steps up as well. So this is a question to each one of us as well, that while these studies are all good, are we making those small steps that we are called to do as well? The third one is not really to wait for others. We often expect a lot more people to become Christians, a lot more people to pray so that all this will go away. But oftentimes it's more about quality rather than quantity, is something that we see in this lesson, that few men or few people and their fervent prayers can make a big difference. A group of 20 like this should be able to make a big difference in this planet, is what we learn, right? So it's a question to all of us and our willingness to move forward. The second thing that is evident is, in a situation like this, before taking any action, is our call to worship, right? We have more time in our hands now. We have lesser commitments, activities that take away our time. There is no sports on TV. There is no commute. There is no whiling away our time that we could do. And so the question is, are we using this more effectively when God puts in the constraints around us so that we are called to spend more time with him? And as Vineet called out earlier as answer to one of the questions, it's very clear that we cannot have an understanding of his ways. And his ways are much higher than our ways, and his thoughts are higher than our thoughts, as it is said in Isaiah. So it is even in this stages like this, something that history has never seen before. All we can look at it and say is, each time God has stepped up, and always he's the hero of the story, and Jesus is the final deliverer. He will come through in this case as well. So with that note, I'm done for today. Thank you all.